I am never going to paint like Greg DeFranco. But what we can do as modelers that is something that doesn't get talked about as much is show imagination and tell stories. Think outside the box. That was the genesis of this panel. These guys don't need all that much introduction. Sheperd Paine literally wrote the book. He wrote 6 books, if you include the one that I did with him on this topic largely. Although he always jokes, nobody reads chapter 1, which is about storytelling. He's got a lot to say about that. Joe Berton was an art teacher for 3 decades. God bless him. Joe has a way of talking to people to explain complicated ideas about art that make them exciting and accessible. And Fletcher Clement, gold-winning medalist last night, is doing stuff that makes you say, wow. That's the subtitle of this panel. How to do stuff that makes us say, wow. So the topic is fostering creativity. And I tossed out that topic to everybody. And they instantly had their areas that they wanted to talk about, which overlap in a lot of ways. But we have 3 different perspectives on a lot of the same subject matter. And then we're going to open it up to questions after they cycle through these topics. Shep was going to lead. Where else do we start besides Shep? With the idea of character in our models.
Well, I think I'm going to start talking about character because character is one thing that you can really bring to stock painted figures. I've often been quoted as saying that painting stock figures is an advanced form of coloring book. And at the lowest level of that, I think that's absolutely true. At the highest level, however, I think there's a lot more to painting figures than advanced coloring book. Neatness counts, but it's not the only thing. What really separates the figure modeler from the other types of modelers is the fact that you're modeling human beings. And human beings have character and personality. And what sets a really good figure apart is that it brings out the character and personality of its subject. If you're making tanks or airplanes or ships or something of that sort, they're mechanical devices. And while they have a certain character as a mechanical device, it's not the same thing as a person. Modeling people is one of the hardest things in the world to do. It's why our hobby has been challenging for all of these years, and it's a thing that I think brings us back to it again and again. So that when you're painting stock figures, as I say, neatness counts, but it's not the only thing. When the judges are judging, one of the things that they really look for is something that sets a figure apart, because quite often you will see the same figure half a dozen times on the table, but the piece that really stands out is the one that has character, not necessarily the one that has the neatest paint job. So that even if you don't necessarily have the technique of a Greg DeFranco where you do extremely neat and precise work, your figures can still have some character. And if your figures have character, I think you will have succeeded in a way that you will not necessarily succeed if you concentrate too much on just technique. Character comes through, I think, as much as anything else in the facial expressions of the people in your scene or in your single figure. This is a piece by Bill Horan, and I think the thing that makes this scene work is the expression on the face of the central character as he's carrying the wounded drummer boy. And I don't think we really need to say too much about it, except that it really is it's what sets it apart as a masterwork, is the fact that the facial expression is so strong. This is a figure that was done many years ago by a man named Jim Wilt. And while it's technically not as good as some of the things that are done today, it remains the coldest figure I've ever seen. The facial expression, the pose, everything about it, he is absolutely freezing to death, and you can really feel it. And I think that again is something that sets a piece apart. I've always really liked this piece just because of that. Character, of course, also comes from the face, and it can come in fantasy as well as in historical pieces.
This, of course, is a portrait of Mike Cobb, the MMSI president.
Thank you very much.
That was before he went to the dentist. This was done by a man named Lyle Conway. It's Tars Tarkas from the John Carter and Mars series. And again, it's a marvelous example of character in fantasy work. The thing that I really like about it is the fact that it's not based on anything else. This is his version of Tars Tarkas. If you see various illustrations of it done by other artists over the time, they're very different from this. And to me, that's what I really look for in fantasy more than anything else, is to see something that is original and is not simply a copy of something that somebody else has done. Character can also come not only from faces, but also from posing and setting. This is a piece that Dan Tizanchik did of Mussolini, and it's a stock figure. But he took the stock figure and he raised it to an entirely new level, both literally and figuratively, by placing it on a platform in front of an Italian armored car. And the setting he's added to it really enhances the pose to a point where it raises everything to an entirely new level. And that's, I think, what makes this piece particularly effective.
So Joe, when I tossed this out to you, the first thing you said is you wanted to talk about the subject matter. Joe is one of the most fascinating people I know. Joe can have an in-depth discussion with the groundskeeper at Wrigley Field, and the next morning an in-depth discussion with the director of the Louvre. And he's fascinated in all of it, and he knows about all of it. So Joe, when you talk about subject matter, what are you talking about?
Well, I think one of the points is trying to get you to expand what you think is a good subject to do for a figure. I think we're totally dominated by little people on small blocks of wood carrying weapons of destruction. So I think if you go beyond that, there's other examples that you can find that are terrific subjects to model. I'm going to stand up because I'm just kind of used to wandering around here. But and then as Jim asked me to be part of this, I realized I really haven't done a thing for competition in many years. So you're going to indulge me for a minute while I show you a few things I do. So if you don't know who I am, at least you can think, oh, he did do some figures at some time. This is a figure, Lucky Lindy. I was fascinated by the fact that Lindbergh landed not only the task of flying overseas for the first time as a single pilot, but there were 100,000 people at the Paris airport meeting him. Philip Stearns by the sideline, when I showed this figure in progress, I had him in berets and all this stuff. He goes, my dear Joe, those Frenchmen never had hats like that. Okay, Philip, why do you know that? Well, my dear boy, I was there on the shoulders of my father. So Philip actually witnessed this. Some of you that remember Philip, it's a great connection with history that he basically saw this event. But then I did a figure of Stanley, flags. There's some interesting composition done with flags even today, with how you use a flag for a subject. This is Stanley. This is an elastoline conversion. Back when some of these were done, not too many people were doing totally scratch figures, but taking existing figures and chopping them up and grinding them down and putting things on it. The elastoline figure, then the gun bearer is Josephine, the Hystrix figure of Josephine that's been really modified. Monet, I did a series of artists as well. The Giverny painting, this is one that is in the Art Institute collection itself, where my wife is a curator. And Vincent van Gogh, coming back from one of his painting excursions. That painting also is in the Art Institute collection. And then some of your inspiration can come, of course, from historical subjects, but I love sculpture. Sculpture has a medium, representational sculpture that we try to do. And there's just a few examples I want to show you that can be inspiring. This is a sculpture by Jerome. Most people know Jerome for his paintings, his flatwood, very realistic Orientalist scenes. There's a great painting of the rug sellers up in the Minneapolis Museum. I was talking to some of the Minneapolis people earlier about that. But it's a beautiful sculpture of Jerome. And Bonaparte's entry into Cairo, and this palm frond on the ground. So much like Jesus going into Jerusalem, they would throw the palm fronds out there. That would make a marvelous figure. No, actually nobody's shooting anybody, but I think it really captures that the conquering, as he viewed himself, hero, but the Egyptians didn't view him that way. But there's a certain beauty to that. This is done by a Belgian artist, Van der Velde. It's part of a series of 8 sculptures at our Art Institute. They're about this tall, put out by Sèvres Porcelain. But what's so beautiful about this is the fluid. And each of these sculptures is a different motion of movement with the scarf and what they're doing. But the details of the different textures of costume, of the cloth, the material, the lightness of the scarf, and you can see it in some of this, but each bit of material in this is sculpted so beautifully. And I think some of us tend to just sculpt, we get the putty going and it just tends to all look the same. We might paint it differently. But in this piece, you can actually see the texture that those materials would have. The light fluffiness of some, and I think the beauty and the composition just works great. One of my favorite sculptors is Charles Jagger, who did a lot of war monuments in London. The Artillery Museum, the Artillery Monument, right by Wellington's house in London, you'll see. But he did this beautiful figure of the Prince of Wales, the Duke of Windsor. He was really liked in England, popular with the people tremendously, much like, in our time, Lady Diana and stuff. But I think this is just a beautiful spirit. I love how he's holding his racket. He's got a cigarette in his hand like he always did. And that would make a fantastic figure for someone to do. And again, the sculptors paid attention to the material. You can get a real feel of the woolliness of that sweater with the fine netting of the tennis racket, the little cigarette in the hand, and the attitude. I love the pose as well. There is a German sculptor, very popular in the Art Deco time. This is Ferdinand Press. And one thing I think we tend to forget is how bodies were portrayed in certain time periods. The women in the 1920s looked differently. Their ideal of feminine beauty and how they were fashioned and the clothing they would be into wearing is different. And you can't stick a 2010 woman in 1920 clothes and it's going to look right. And I think some of us tend to do that. It's our whole Hollywood version of sculpting. They all look like people we know now. We just stick them in period costume. And we need to pay attention, I think, more of the body type of that period as well. And there's some great sporting figures that he did. I just wanted to show you so you know this name. You might want to look back at it. But wouldn't that be a great miniature? And in real life, it's about 6 inches tall, made of ivory and bronze. And he's got this tennis player. I think it's just fantastic too. Now, I want to show you some figures that we've had done over the years of subject matter that I think is appealing. Anders' piece of a cowboy with a saddle in the back. Jackson Pollock by Bob Cabot. Fletcher isn't the only one who does artists, so though he did his own version of Pollock, we'll talk a little bit about. But it's a fantastic, I think it captures a bit of energy. What's interesting about this subject matter is that it's basically Pollock as you would see him that day in his studio. How our friend Fletcher does Pollock is how his vision of 2012 sees the artist in a 1950s studio. So what he's doing with his things is really fantastically different. Most of us will view the subject and try and get it as perfect as we can for that exact day or time period or year, while Fletcher puts his own twist on it as well, like the Van Gogh figure. That is another fascinating way to handle an interesting subject, but do it uniquely to his.
Van Gogh.
Right.
Van Gogh, yes.
And this is Fletcher's piece on Churchill. Interesting subject matter, but to take a famous person and put him into a different type of attitude, scene, things he likes to do. All of us have heard of Churchill. Only some of us might know he was an accomplished painter and would spend some time relaxing and enjoying that as part of his daily life. This is Fletcher's version of Churchill. Rick Taylor's Columbo. So you might find interesting subjects in popular media. Mike's piece, The Emperor's New Clothes. Different from Mike, another figure that doesn't rely on so much of his action pieces and swinging of weapons and things. Good use of warm and cool colors. Fantastic piece. Now, we in America tend to view a lot of our subjects English or French. What I love about getting to know some of the European modelers is that they've got a bigger history book, or at least they've got a different volume to it. So you get the Italian modelers doing the Italian colonial campaigns, and some of the German modelers messing with the Germans in East Africa. This guy, Ricardo Roberti, he does the colonial periods of his country as well, but he does the other guys, the guys defending their country. So there's some fantastic things you can do with native troops too. I've done some Sudanese things, but Ricardo's done some fantastic stuff with New Guinea, the Morays. So at MFCA, I've seen his work. I don't see too much of his things displayed here. Interesting subject. My Picasso people at the Art Institute love this. They're doing a big Picasso retrospective. I'm showing this to Gloria. And here's Fletcher's way of, yeah, we all know Picasso. We know what he looks like visually. And then you get this wonderful twisted view of it that Fletcher delivers. Jason Green, hanging out with Mike, Mike Tabb, who's predominantly a painter. And then at MFCA, hanging out with painters instead of, usually my group is doing, sculpting and manipulating stuff. To hear them, what they can do with creativity and using paintbrushes and modeling is wonderful too. The new tube of paint that might come up, they get excited about. I'm still using the paint that Shep told me to buy 20 years ago, but these guys know the latest hits. But in a subject matter, you're seeing a lot more variety being done in busts. If you look at even what's on display at this show, the subjects of the busts, what they're being done, most of the time the busts aren't going to hold some weapon or, so you're already doing away with the action scene. But it's gone to the traditional form of art, portraying the human head in a very creative way. John Rosengrant, Valley Forge. You can take a traditional subject, kind of what Shep showed with the other Valley Forge piece, and really, I think, do something different with it. John tends to really pay attention to the sculptural detail of the clothing, the heaviness of clothing, how it would appear as it's worn, with any sort of breeze blowing, how parts of it might respond differently to the natural environment, what weathers over the years. So the details that you see in John, it's a great overall impression when you see it, but there's really a lot more there to keep looking at. And then finally, Greg Mowry from one of the LA groups. Greg does usually traditional dressed figures, Imperial Guard and all that. He does reenactments. He's got all these, this and that, Colonel and gold Napoleonic braid things. But I love this figure. Dressed figure, this is one of the Wizard of Oz. I don't know the name of the guys. Isn't that great? And it's about 12 inches tall. Dressed figures, he's got the fuzzy hat and all that, but taking that traditional medium, doing something really unique with the subject matter, and coming up with that.
So Fletcher, when I said, okay, where do you want to start? You said, one piece, you got to go right there. That's the piece to talk about. And we talked then about why, and it really came down to the precise act of choosing the exact right moment to show. Again, chapter 1, which nobody reads, Shep's little illustration, the boot about to step into the puddle, or the boot having just stepped into the puddle, is more interesting than being in the middle of it. So you said, we got to talk about this.
Yeah, we've got to talk about Lee at Appomattox, which I think is one of Shep's seminal pieces. It's one of the pieces that illustrated for me. I think I always intuitively knew that you tell the story either before the action or just after the action and not during the event. This is a wonderful evocative, creates a wonderfully evocative mood of Lee waiting for Grant to come and accept the surrender. He's got a very forlorn, depressed kind of look on his face. His aide is looking out the window, looking at his watch, and you can't see it in this particular slide, but Grant is approaching up the steps. It's a heart-wrenching moment for me. It's much more effective than Grant and Lee sitting at a small Queen Anne table signing the surrender document. There's so much tension, there's so much drama. The fate of the Confederacy rests in the next few moments, and it's reflected in Lee's face. I think that I think Shep is a master at storytelling. He understands where the dramatic tension is. He understands the flow of narrative. I've seen many dioramas and vignettes of, say, Pickett's Charge. The best one I ever saw was Lee greeting the returning, defeated, battered soldiers and offering his apologies to them, saying it was all my fault. And I thought, this was just a terrific piece.
You guys can interrupt each other too. I know some of you have a lot of different thoughts on different pieces. So don't be so nice to each other. And again, we're going to throw this out to questions. First, I wanted to give you guys the chance to hear these people talk, and because I never get tired of it. Shep, you said the other thing, just as important as character, or maybe how we get to the future, is pushing the envelope. So what do you mean by pushing the envelope?
Well, pushing the envelope is basically testing the limits of what's possible. I think, to me, that's always what's made the hobby exciting. There's a terrible tendency, I think, even among the best painters, to keep doing the same kind of thing over and over again simply because it works and it's safe. Pushing the envelope is trying something that nobody's tried before to see whether you can actually pull it off.
Now, but Shep, that having been said, some of these pieces you can work 6 months on. What about when you get to month 5 and 3 weeks and you didn't pull it off?
Yeah.
Hey, sometimes you succeed, sometimes you fail. If you're too afraid to fail, nobody ever makes any progress. That's how mankind learned to fly. There's a lot of people failed before the Wright brothers finally managed to get up in the air.
Okay.
It's the mistakes we learn from, actually.
I have heard tell of slide rules that would occasionally go through the plasterboard walls at Valiant, but I don't see a lot of unfinished boxes in your house.
One way you can push the envelope, as Joe has mentioned, is by the choice of subjects. This is one of Joe's pieces, The Rug Seller. Joe, as everybody knows, specializes in camels, and Lord knows we've seen enough dervishes and various other ethnic groups charging along on camels over the years. The thing that makes this piece really unusual is it's a civilian subject. And anybody who has ever been to Egypt and has been badgered by the rug sellers will identify with this piece, so that there's an emotional reaction to it as well. But I think I'm not going to talk too much more about this because Joe's talked fairly extensively already about choice of subject matter, but that is certainly one way that you can push the envelope. This is another example of the same thing. This is a piece that was done by Phil Bracco. Again, it's a civilian subject, although it's really set during the Vietnam War. It could be set during peacetime as well. He's made some interesting choices with this in that he's got a small boy and a water buffalo, and by having the water buffalo in the water, he's only showing the water buffalo's head and the boy from the waist up. Well, there are a couple of things that can go into this. I like to think that the reason he did this is because that's all that he really needs to show. If he showed the rest of the water buffalo, the scene that you see here would then become only a part of the whole, whereas this way you can concentrate on the entire event. Sometimes, however, that is not true. I mean, it could just as easily be from the fact that Phil tried to do it and discovered he couldn't sculpt the buffalo's legs right. So, but I think the idea of having it in the water is extremely effective, and this is really a good example of choosing a subject that's totally outside the box. This is a piece by Dave Brown, The Rusted Tomb. This was, again, a tremendous risk because he's doing a scene that's underwater. And what you can't see in this is that when you actually see the scene itself, you can see the rippling of the light on the water on the tank in the scene. And he actually had a pan of water up on top of it with a fan blowing across it to give the rippled effect, and it really worked. But this was, again, it's an example of taking a risk because it could fail. But I think in this case it came off absolutely brilliantly. This is another one of Dave's pieces. This is Daniel Chester French sculpting the Lincoln Memorial. And again, it's a very simple scene. The thing that really makes it work more than anything else is the enormous size of the Lincoln bust compared to the sculpture. And I think, it's there. I wouldn't say there is much risk involved in this. It's just a brilliant idea that's been carried forward extremely well. I don't think there was a lot of chance that this would fail. But the difference is that he found a good idea and he wasn't afraid to carry it forward. In fantasy work, this is a piece that was done by Spencer Van Gulik, who still remains my favorite fantasy artist. Again, what Spencer did that you don't see as much in fantasy these days is he did original stuff. This is called Daddy, Is That You? And if you look over on the side, you can see the shape of goblins in the trees. And those of you who are familiar with fantasy art will realize that the goblins are based on pieces that were done by Brian Froud. And but Spencer took that and basically incorporated into his own work and his own ideas and created something that was entirely new about it. And again, at the time that this was done close to 30 years ago. That was entirely new, and it's something I would like to see more in the fantasy world than we see now. This is one of Fletcher's pieces. This is Edward Hopper. When it comes to pushing the envelope, I don't think there's anyone who does it more than Fletcher. And I think I've often told Fletcher, I said the thing that's remarkable about his work is that he takes more risks than anyone I know. He isn't afraid to fail, and sometimes he succeeds and sometimes he fails. But the fact remains that he's not afraid to fail, and he'll bring half a dozen pieces to the show, and you'll see 2 or 3 that you really like, and a couple of others that sort of have you scratching your head. But if you don't try, you don't succeed.
Now, Fletcher, this one, there was something that I didn't notice until I was talking to you. The figure on the bed is different than the figure in the picture.
Yeah, there's a little backstory here. I don't like to do a literal reproduction of a painting. I like to try to add or take away something that makes it at least original for me. The guy on the bed is bald-headed, which Edward Hopper was, as many of you know. The guy in the painting is not. Hopper frequently used his wife as a model. In this case, this is not his wife, so he painted a man in there that did not represent Hopper. The rest of the story is, if this isn't his wife, who is it if this is Edward Hopper?
If any of you are sticking around and going to the Art Institute tomorrow, unfortunately, all of our Hoppers are in Paris right now for a retrospective.
If you get to Paris, it's at the Grand Palais.
There you go. Now, all of you guys wanted to talk about this piece. It's a stock piece.
Well, I picked this one simply because this is Jason Whitman's Robert Capa, who was one of the great photographers of World War II. And Jason chose to do it entirely in black and white because, of course, that was how Capa took his photographs. And this is based upon a photograph that was taken of Capa in Sicily in 1943. And I think it's something of a risk because it's all done in black and white. But I think it's very, very successful. It's appropriate to the subject, and I think the fact that it's done in black and white gives it a depth and an understanding that you wouldn't get if it were simply done in color.
What did you
done in color, it'd simply be another paratrooper.
What did you like about it, Joe, when we first saw it at MFCA?
I like the subject. I thought handling black and white, there are many, many shades of gray in here. I love the whole handling of the piece. I mean, the subject matter is great. I think that it's another piece that was waiting to be done. And Jason did a fantastic job with it.
This is a piece that was done by Hans Reuters many years ago. Again, this was done about 30 years ago of the Star Wars. And the thing that was remarkably effective about this one is the use of forced perspective. The figures in the background are actually about 3 or 4 inches behind the main figures, and they're much smaller. Forced perspective is something that either works or totally fails. It's a great risk when you do it, and if you pull it off, it can be very, very effective, as it is in this case. But it's a question of getting the angles right and everything else, because it has to look right. When you do forced perspective that way, it can't look right from just one angle. It has to look right from every angle. You can't have any any angle where it doesn't look right destroys the illusion entirely. So it's, again, it's a question of taking a risk, and if you're going to be successful in this sort of thing, I think you really have to try and push the envelope. I think we're starting to see more and more of that now. We went through a period for a number of years where people were tending to do safe subjects. We went through a period, for example, where even the best of show was going to the least boring vignette every year. Now we're starting to see people trying some new and interesting things. And to me, I think that's the thing that really brings the lifeblood to the hobby, is pushing the envelope and finding out what are the limits of what we can do in this hobby. This is a piece that was here last year. This was done by John Harbuck. It's the monument to the 54th Massachusetts in Boston, and the idea of the living figure gradually transformed into the bronze monument, I think, is extremely effective. Again, it's one of those things that it could have failed, but I think he pulled it off brilliantly. It's very nicely sculpted and designed, and I just think it works beautifully.
Although, Joe, we were talking about this, and John's not here this year, right? It's not what you said, Shep. It's not the living figure transformed into the bronze monument, because scanning from left to right, as we all do, it's the bronze monument coming to life.
Yeah, I think it can also be looked at that way. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. You would have done it the other way, Joe. You did say that.
I had suggested I would have done it the other way.
I thought of it the other way too, but I can see both ways.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with it either way, but I think you're right. I think if he had put the figure over on the other side, it would have been the living figure fading into history of the monument. Where here it's the monument coming to life. I think that's a very good point.
Either way you cut it, though, he tried something really interesting. This one's got to appeal to you, right, Fletcher?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Joe, you got a lot of images in this next one.
Okay,
I'll cycle through more quickly. This isn't the auction, you know.
Sorry.
People got questions.
Some of you guys have an 11 o'clock appointment. What have I got? Slides outside the box. All right. Doing something a bit different, whether it's with paint, subject matter, groundwork. I'll run through some of these with you. One of the best guys at Shep and I and Bart, there's a few of us that, because we're old now. But when we met Henry, Henry was 60, and we thought he was old then, you know. Now what the hell, we're all getting there. But Henry was fantastic. Henry would do stuff with paint that some of you young painters, you would have loved to know Henry. Henry would show up. Henry, what is that? Joe, and he's a little French guy. Joe, I'll tell you what that is. That is a black horse under a full moon at night. And that was his challenge. That's what he wanted to paint. He would just do exercises with paint. Some things would be finished like this with figures, but he'd always have a few of these challenges he would test himself on what they would do. I mean, those of you that you're so focused on paint, he's got a book, he gets into some of that, you can still find it, it's called My Way. But if you just get your kicks out of the hobby with paint, look in the Henry line. One of our best painters today, I think, is Jason Green. He does wonderful things with paint. Those of us that do focus more on sculpting can learn a lot from him with what he does. Noelle, I think is here.
She's asleep.
This piece was wonderful with painted light on the base. Magical. When you see that, how did you do that? But it's just a wonderful, simple approach to doing something different with paint. Now, what do you do with backgrounds? About 10 years ago, 15 years ago, some people started to do these backgrounds on figures, not just the basic groundwork, but framing it with a built background of some sort. This is Joe Hudson's Wild Bill Hickok. I've got a few examples that I think work really well with background. And then Mike Bedard, some people call these wedgies, is that the term that some people like to use? But instead of, why model the whole tank? I want to focus on the figure. You can go ahead and do this little wedgie, much like Dan's piece with Mussolini that Sheperd showed. John Long's Old Captain. What you say in white? No need to do the whole tank. Those of you that want to do focus on the figure, slice the little tail off the airplane or the turret, Groundwork, interesting piece, The Old Captain by John Long. I'm sorry, that other one was Dan Tassancek. Chet Baker by Fletcher. Sometimes I think, Fletcher, you can help, at least me as a viewer, if you give us some explanation. Because I love, and I deal with artists and I get into this with museums and signage on paintings and all that. But what Fletcher does, and as he explains the backstory, I love it as it is and I respond to it. And then I love it more when I get the footnotes.
Well, the year Fletcher brought this, he brought me over right away as soon as it came out of the box. He said, "You're the only one in this room that's going to understand this," because of course I know Chet Baker's story.
Yeah, well, Chet Baker, as many of you know, was a incredibly talented trumpet player, a beautiful young man who unfortunately early in life got hooked on drugs and hard drugs and eventually heroin, but he was in his late 50s,
And give us more. So if you want to put anything out when you display it, I love the backstory too. Now Fletcher and some others have done this thing where they're playing around with different scales on the same piece. There was a Western artist who lived in the 70s who just died recently, but he would do like a bust of India, and then coming across the chest part would be the mounted Indians as well. And I love what Fletcher did with this subject, where he's got the bust of Lawrence, the figure of Lawrence, and then the smaller kind of HO scale figures up in front. This whole manipulation and use of scale to tell a story, I think, is a wonderful approach.
It's almost like a movie poster rendered in 3D.
Jason Whitman's piece on Otto Dix. Now Fletcher, this would be a good segue into his piece, but he did a piece dealing with Otto Dix as well. But he was a young guy, joins the Army in 1914, German, and witnesses the horrors of war. He's wounded in action a couple of times, comes back to peacetime Germany. He's very disillusioned by the society that he comes back to as well. So, and a twisted revisit of nightmares, really for the rest of his life. He dies in the 60s, so it's a great span of First World War, Second World War II, and German response to the horrors of war. And this is Jason's bit to it. And then Fletcher even takes us a bit further with some of his pieces that we'll get into a little later. The kid Jason, or Dieter Manningly, black and white. Jason's Kappa wasn't the first figure. This was at our show a few years ago. Dieter has passed away, but wonderful things with stock figures, doing something very interesting with them.
I love the fact that he only had to buy 2 figures, because clearly the bottom one and the top
That's
one,
true.
you just cut them in half. Right?
We'll cut the cell right here.
If he did it differently,
Another
he would have had to buy
70
3.
Yeah. Steve's done these great things with airplanes, with people. And he'll have these crash scenes, he's got 20 little figures on him, and someone's taking a movie of him and stuff. So it's an interesting way of doing ordnance pieces, but telling more of a human story with it. This piece I saw for the first time live out in Philadelphia, done by our Greek friends, Michael and Chris, and I always mess up their last name. You've seen this published, but it's taking an interesting fantasy subject and doing something beautifully bizarre and handled in such an exquisite way.
And the cloth looks a lot like what you were showing us earlier, Joe, with those statues.
Yeah, they are really some skilled modelers. It'd be fascinating to see what they turn out over the next few years. Thinking outside the box. I love what Barry's doing. Thinking outside the box was really inside the box. He's doing wonderful things with these small little shadow boxes. Dennis had another one-figure shadow box in there. When you can do, I think, extremely worthwhile contained subjects with a focused figure or two. And I think Barry succeeds wonderfully with this as well.
All right, Fletcher, you wanted to talk about inspiration. And I know you were special ops in Vietnam, but I'd have sworn you took every LSD and psychotropic drug that could have been had in those years.
Product of a diseased mind, I guess.
The most frequent Fletcher question, how did you come up with that?
Yeah,
Always.
Where do you get your ideas? And I've never been able to come up with a decent response to that. You know, everywhere. I mean, there's just ideas everywhere. One of the there are a lot of people in this hobby that I admire and that inspire me. And Dave Brown, we've already seen some of his work, and John Long and Mike Blank. Probably at the very apex of inspiration among figure makers is Costas, and I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name. Karyatoulis. There's something that's there's a brilliant conception with Costas. There's a incandescent agility with his ideas and with his execution. It's like a ballet of the imagination, and it has such wonderful atmosphere. It really doesn't matter what it's about. It's a little bit like, I think it was Archibald MacLeish said, a poem should not mean, it should be. And I feel that way with Costas pieces. And I run up against people at the show that say, well, I don't know what it is. And so you hear the discount in their voice. And it really doesn't matter sometimes what it is. There's just this great spirit, this mood, this atmosphere that he creates that nobody else comes close to.
And obviously his work is so complex and difficult, but there is a fringe benefit for us mere mortals if we try a figure like this. There's no way you can get the horned face wrong if you're making it up out of thin air. You know what I mean?
Right. There's a fragility to his pieces. You know, you feel like if you just kind of blew on them, they would evaporate.
Yeah.
So just a magic about it.
So you wanted to talk a little bit about Otto Dix. You won a gold for this the Otto Dix Dream of Hieronymus Bosch piece.
Right. Once again, I'm inspired by what other artists have done on two-dimensional paintings, but I try not to literally recreate one of their paintings. And I did a triptych, and Dix was famous for his triptychs. And I sort of borrowed from several triptychs and from one of that painting right there, which is, I think, called Flanders. I wanted to realize it in a three-dimensional form, but I didn't want to do the typical painter in front of the canvas doing the work deck. It works sometimes, but it gets a little old, and it wouldn't work for an Otto Dix painting. So I had to do something a little bit different, and I sort of integrated some of his ideas and images along with my interpretation of some of his ideas and energy, put it into a three-dimensional format, and went from there.
This is one of those triptychs.
Yeah, that's actually a triptych on a predella. The bottom panel, the fourth panel, is called a predella, which in Italian means stool or bench. He borrowed that from the medieval painters who did a lot of religious paintings using that format. That piece right there, I think the only piece I literally borrowed from this triptych is the amputee, the World War I German amputee. The rest of it was, I had a floozy in mind, but it's just sort of suggested by those other two panels. Yeah, here's the lady that was inspired by the previous slide. And what I finally did was I realized the plate, and this is a little thing, but sometimes they're really important. The plate did not complement the diorama, so I had it redone in black plastic, and it was much more subtle and muted, and it worked a lot better.
So it changed from what we saw here.
Yeah, but no, change. What you had here,
right.
Yeah, was the change. And this is just really a close-up. I've created the panels of the triptych in wood with gold inset, but I tilted the end panels because if I'd done it linear, it would have been a little tedious and a little boring. So.
And we have one close-up of the...
Yeah, and I did her in a little bit of a cartoonish manner because Dix painted that way. He painted in very dramatic colors and tones and exaggeration, so that was consistent with his style.
All right, so you guys have three of the greatest minds in the hobby as far as trying new stuff up here at your disposal to take as many questions as you want to throw their way. Have at 'em.
I have a question for Fletcher. When you're developing the concept for some of these elaborate art history pieces, really, do you do sketches first, or how do you proportion out in your mind?
I do the most rudimentary, primitive, single sketch, and then I kind of see it in my mind's eye, and I make a lot of impromptu changes and adjustments while I'm working on the piece that I think always makes the piece better, because I'm never quite sure exactly where we're going to go. But I trust my instincts that when we get there, it will be a satisfactory journey.
Because, you know, the masters naturally work with the concept of the golden ratio, and yours fall right into that. So I thought maybe, perchance, you actually considered it, you know, the golden ratio and how things fit within that.
No, I'm a seat of the pants, fly-by-night kind of miniaturist, and a lot of these people are consummately organized, and I think that's great. It just doesn't work for me.
That's a good topic. I mean, can one be an impressionist miniaturist?
Well, you know, Doug, you saw his show yesterday, and he'll tell you what he does, and when you see the presentation, you realize he has to have thought this out, step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I admire that, but it doesn't work for me, because I'm just not that organized.
Thank you.
Jim commented earlier on pushing the envelope, that what do you do when you get 5 3/4 months into the piece and find out it won't work? Some of you know I'm a ship model builder, and as an example of the question I want to ask, a number of years ago I wanted to do a U.S. between the wars cage mast battleship that have the very neat elliptical mast made out completely out of rods, steel rods. And so I built the mast first, because there was no point in building the ship and then finding out I couldn't build the masts. And I wanted to ask you gentlemen if you ever do that. If you're pushing the envelope on something, do you do the hardest part first, just because you have to know if you can do it?
I think that's a very good approach. I think I've done that a couple of times. Certainly when you're painting, sometimes it's one reason that sometimes people will paint the face first, because they realize if the face isn't going to work, the rest of it's not going to work. And sometimes, particularly when you're starting out, it takes 2 or 3 tries to get the face right, which means that you take the figure and you dip it into paint remover and start over again. Well, if you've painted all the rest of the figure and have to dip the face into the paint remover, you use where the rest of the uniform goes too. So you're better off, yes, you're better off to start with the hard part and make sure that you can actually get it done. But I think this also comes down to the idea of planning. A good example of this is, I remember years ago, I was toying with the idea of doing a British square from Waterloo by using a pair of mirrors. And I was going to create a pair of mirrors at a right angle. And I was going to have 2 sides of the square facing against the mirror, so the mirror created the other 3/4 of the square. And I had all of these little Airfix 20mm figures, and I thought, this is going to be great. I can do a 400-man square with only painting 100 figures. This is going to be really great. Well, I started doing all the planning. I laid it out and everything else, and with the Airfix figures all in yellow plastic, it looked absolutely fantastic. And then I suddenly looked at it more closely, and I suddenly realized that the mirror reflections, all of the figures were facing the opposite direction. And the idea of the square and the whole illusion of the square and the mirror disappeared, because you could tell where the mirror was, because the figures suddenly reversed. At which point I scrapped the entire idea. So to a certain degree, doing planning will help you avoid getting 3/4 of the way through a project and suddenly discovering it won't work.
To a certain degree, but I can testify that the downside of these Friday breakfasts with Joe and Shep, and Mike is always laughing at this, is I bring the work in progress, They tell me 6 ways it sucks. It goes back home, I tear it up again. I have never sculpted a figure once beginning to end. It's about 7 times each time. Now, I happen to like sculpting. This is my hobby. I enjoy it. So, like, hey, Jim, you got to go back to the drawing board and play with the knee tight again. Oh, boy, okay. It hasn't driven me crazy yet. I'm going to stop bringing stuff to breakfast when it does. Fletcher, what is your workbench, or what is your shelf of abortions like? Because that's got to be something to see, man.
Fortunately, very, very few, but I'm not always sure where my point of greatest difficulty is going to occur in a piece, because I don't plan that far ahead, and I'm frequently have that old crap moment, you know, where you stop and go back and do what Doug Cohen or Sheperd Joe would have done on the front end. So it lengthens the period of time that of a piece I'm working on frequently, but that's just you know, I surprise you pay for being who you are.
And some pieces just aren't ready to finish. I deal with this sometimes, and I run into this even with my wife and her books. Now, bear me out for a second. She reads a lot of fiction, and she insists on finishing the book, even if it's a lousy book. And I go, that's the joy of nonfiction. You can just read the chapter you want, and you don't care. It doesn't have to fit into a sequence. And I think some of us get focused on a figure, you get the 5 months into it, and you're damn determined to finish it. Well, in some cases, you know what? Just put it away. It's not going to get any better having a finish sign on it. If it's not working, give it up, put it away, let it rest, move on to something else, get back to it later. The Lindbergh piece, that was my second try. The first try is someplace at home. It just wasn't working. I tried it. It was Hysterex conversions. Hysterex are harder to work with. That's with Airfix parts. It just did not work. And it would have been awful if I finished it and put it out, because it never would have looked right with Hysterex parts.
But
So sometimes just give it up.
That's you guys talking, all right? And your level is way above most of us in the room. And one thing that really breaks my heart is when I have some people come up to me here and say, I tried something, I just couldn't finish it, it's never going to get there. You do have to finish some and have some, you know, certificate level work before you get to the bronze level work. Not that that's why we're doing it, right?
Well, but not to jump in, but the other thing is to get advice before you finish it.
Right.
I mean, I have people ask me, what do you think? Here, it's done, it's in competition, and I think, you know what? What's that figure doing there? And it's well, then I start hearing the debate, and you know what? We should have this discussion a month before you finish it. Otherwise, just tell me thumbs up, thumbs down, because some of that feedback, get feedback when you can still do something with it. If you know you're struggling with it, ask your friends, ask the modelers who you like, look at it in the mirror, get a fresh idea to it. Sometimes putting it away and looking at it again, eventually it'll come out at you. But one of the joys of any club that you're part of, you're not isolated. Get help before it's done, and you can save a lot of mistakes.
And we're spoiled here in Chicago because there's so many of us. There's a critical mass. But if you're in Arkansas, if you're in Salt Lake City,
Michigan.
you know, Michigan, maybe there's an IPMS club, and you're not going to show, you know.
Well, with the internet, I mean, you show me stuff with your camera photos now. With
Right.
the internet, you can, if you want to see kelp, you can find it.
Right.
The trick that Joe mentioned that is a really good one is looking at it in the mirror, because the mirror suddenly reverses everything, and it's just like looking at the piece all over again, at the piece anew. It's a great trick. It's a good way to check your painting. It's a great way to check your sculpting. It's a good way to check the composition of a piece to see how well it really works. And literally, you just pick it up, carry it into the bathroom, look at it in the bathroom mirror, and you'll see all sorts of things you didn't see because you get used to seeing it a certain way. Now,
One thing I like to do when I sculpt is use all these different parts and really can't see what's opaque or not. So I actually hold the figure against the light, making a silhouette of what I was sculpting. Then you can easily see the volume and the roundness and the shape and outline of the figure. I can recommend it. You hold it against the light and it becomes like a black silhouette, and it's easier to see for the sheer volume of the figure.
Great idea.
Shep, I have a question for you. How do you, do you have any rules of thumb for calculating force perspective?
You can get books on perspective. It is a mathematical formula and that sort of thing. The thing that really determines whether forced perspective is going to work is the level of the horizon. Again, when if you're going to try doing forced perspective, you really need to study perspective a little bit before you do it. It's not one of those things I think you can do by instinct unless you're very lucky.
No, I think it is neat.
But it has to do with where the horizon is, and usually when forced perspective fails, it's because the viewpoint is either too high or too low. The viewpoint has to be just right, and it means you have to restrict the viewpoint in such a way that you don't catch the figures at the wrong angle where the forced perspective starts to fall apart.
Well, Dennis and I had one of those long hospitality suite conversations about forced. Remember any of that, Dennis?
I do.
Okay, it was debatable.
Really?
30 odd boxes, Shep. You had one that did forced perspective. It was the Son of the Morning Star with the hill. You didn't. Now Dennis's contention about your box dioramas was that it was always foreground. The action was always in your face. And I said, I don't know. We had to fix up. Joe and me helped fix up the victory box. And, you know, there were like 3 levels of action actually happening in a very tight space. Can you talk a little bit about the composition of those scenes and why you didn't use forced perspective or any of that stuff?
I didn't use forced perspective, I think mostly just because I didn't think the scenes particularly called for it. If a scene called for it, I certainly would have hesitated to use it. It's just that the scenes I was doing didn't really call for that sort of thing. I certainly don't have any objections to doing it. The only one I did which used a bit of forced perspective, as you said, was the Son of the Morning Star, and that was simply because we had to have the monument disappearing. But it really wasn't forced perspective with the figures, it was just forced perspective with the tombstones on the hill, which is a fairly easy thing to do.
But that brings up what you just said is the stories didn't call for it. I'd like to hear each of you guys talk about that, the story. Because that's where all of you in your very different styles start with every piece. Fletcher's got some.
Yeah, let me address that a little bit. There's a famous scene in the movie, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, at the end, and everybody assumes that it was Jimmy Stewart, the now senator from New Mexico or wherever, and they're talking about who really shot Liberty Valance. Of course, we, the viewing audience, know it was John Wayne. But at the end, one of the newspaper guys says to Stewart, when the legend conflicts with reality, print the legend. I think many times this is true with scenes and figures and vignettes where somebody gets hung up on the absolute historical minutia and incorporates it, and it kills the drama and the effect of a piece. And so I think when you have to choose between the legend and reality, and the legend makes a better piece, go with the legend.
I think that brings up a good point, is I think there is a tendency, I think, on the part of people to get so tied up in the minutia of it that they forget the overall picture. If you're doing a figure, for example, of a bunch of soldiers roasting hot dogs over a fire, the actual length of a hot dog at that particular period is not that important. A hot dog is a hot dog. As long as it looks like a hot dog and the audience can tell that it's a hot dog, that's all that really matters. Don't get yourself overworked up about some of the historical minutia. I know when Jim was bringing some of his pieces in for criticism, he would come in and he'd say, well, you know, I did my historical research and, you know, it says this and that or the other thing. And I said, yes, but that isn't going to work in the scene. Don't let that hang you up. Do what looks right and what advances the story.
Now you think I'm bad. Barry's guitarist, punk guitarist, backstage in progress. He spent 2 hours online researching what pop tops on beer cans before they replaced them with the new ones look like. We can drive ourselves crazy. And what's important is the story in that piece.
Now, if he had a broader fan base, he could have found out quicker. Just been asking the people that popped them.
He could have come to any of you guys.
But yes, I think it's very important that when you're dealing with something where there's a story involved, the story is the most important part of it, and you want to be sure that the story gets across. I think probably the best example I can think of that is when I did the Shady Side of the Shire, which had the hobbits visiting the red light district of the Shire. I thought it was a great idea, and I thought, well, all I really have to do to tell this story is I'm going to have these little hobbit figures, and they're going to be standing out in front of a house with a whole bunch of red lights over the houses. And so I took the idea and I tested it out. After I got it finished, I tested it out with a friend of mine, and I said, well, what do you think? And he said, oh, it's great, I love it, I love this, and I love that, and the other thing. And I said, well, what's going on in there? And he looked at me blankly and said, I have no idea. And I said, well, what about these red lights over the houses? He thought, oh, I thought all hobbits had red lights over the houses. And so what it meant was that I had to keep testing it with different people and keep adding clues to it until they finally understood what the scene was about. And by the time I was done, the next step was to go and say, well, I'm going to put a red light over the whorehouse, and the other houses will have yellow lights, so that you can tell. Well, that wasn't enough either. And by the time I was done, I finally ended up having a sign over the door that said the Garden of Earthly Delights. And I had a sign with a big lip on it hanging from the branch overhead. And I had a gap-toothed hobbit hooker in a beehive hairdo sticking her head out the door. And I had to do all of those things in order to get the storyline to come across. So sometimes you have to test it with your audience to see how well they're going to react.
Fletcher, when Joe was talking about the Chet Baker piece and the story enhancing it, do you consider it a failed piece or a successful piece? Does it matter to you that the 9 out of 10 people who don't know that Baker threw himself out the window or fell out the window?
Well, it matters to me, but I think I'm a big believer in the thrill of discovery, and I'm a big believer in not condescending or talking down to my audience. Some people will see the piece and and they come up and say, I don't understand it, what's the backstory, and you tell them, and they go, well, okay. But I think there has to be some subtlety in a piece, and I think you cannot deny your viewer that thrill of discovery where he goes, wow, hey Bob, come look at this. This is, and then he explains the piece. I think people enjoy that. And I don't think you need to tattoo what the piece is about. There was a piece at the show here where somebody explained a euphemism that somebody famously delivered, and on the plaque it said, this is thus and such and so and so and so and so and so. Why bother?
Yeah. I liked what Joe said earlier about the broader history book. I mean, not being a Victorian army buff. When I first saw Haran's Get into that. What the fuck is that about? I have no idea, right? And then you read about it, and I was like, wow, okay. And I love when pieces turn me on to do reading and to find out.
Well, I think also that I don't think there's anything wrong with having a somewhat limited audience for a piece either. I think the Chet piece is a classic example of one where you have to know the story in order to understand the piece. And it doesn't mean that a piece is a failure simply because it's aimed at a smaller or a limited audience. Sure, you have to explain it to some other people, but that doesn't mean that it's a failure.
Well,
but it's a failure is when everybody sort of looks at it and scratches their head and nobody understands what's there.
Barry's Guitarist in Progress is modeled on Johnny Thunders of the New York Dolls, right? There's probably 3 people in this room who know that. He got Paul Weller, somebody else said Mick Jagger. It doesn't matter. You can appreciate it without knowing who it is, or you can appreciate it knowing who it is.
If I could touch on that, being a professional artist and illustrator, I think you have to look at it from who you does. Is it going to be fine art? And in fine art, you can go all the way from Vasily Kandinsky up to Rembrandt. Or is it going to be an illustration? And your demographics are the Saturday Evening Post. And whereas everybody will understand it, it's the Gillis figure, it's the kids running, that Andrea's stealing, all of those things. So, is it fine art or is it illustration?
Norman Rockwell or Jackson Pollock.
Yep. Yeah, really. It's your story. It's what you want to convey. But the two of them are much different because one is pure storytelling. You've got a 2D surface. You're trying to sell a product, which is the magazine, and you've got only so much time to view it. Fine art, you can sit there all day and scratch your head and try to figure out what it was, and it doesn't make a difference. Illustrations, it's different. So when I look at pieces like that, I have to think: is this more of an illustrative piece, or is this more of a fine arts piece? Just my 2 cents.
But they both depend on the response. You know, art has to have a response, otherwise you can stay in the closet with your stuff. So you need the viewer to respond. My point about giving more information is that that can help enlighten my initial response. So if it's the artist bringing things to set on the table, you've made the conscious decision of what you're going to bring. Now, maybe as part of an educator in me, you've made that decision. Now, help me if I want to broaden my perspective on it. If I don't want to read about it, I just look, view, respond, walk away. If I want to know a little bit more, maybe there's some information there. Museums will usually give you more information. Now, I've had this debate with museum directors, and artists will differ on this as well. But at least you've got a choice of how you want to pursue it. With technology now, museums are going even further. If you want to know more about that painting, click this button on the receiver and you can hear the artist talking about it. You can hear the museum director responding to it, why we've chosen it for the collection. I think if you can add more to what the viewer brings to that, how he's looking at it, responding to it, the more information, the better. If you don't want to read it, you don't have to. If it's there to learn more, it's there.
Well, like Joe, I'm a teacher now too. I teach reviewing the arts at Columbia College, and I have my class in criticism essentially start with the reading of Nabokov's Good Readers, Good Writers. All right, and what this essay by this great novelist says is that sometimes you have to read a piece 3 or 4 times to really get it. That doesn't mean it's so dense and obfuscatory and joyless that you don't understand it, but that the second and third reading, if it's a good piece of writing, gives you layers of depth. And to make the kids understand that in the class, I show them 2 paintings. First is Thomas Kincaid, painter of shit, Swans on a Lake, all right? You get it in 3 seconds, okay? Birds, lake, water. And then I show them Salvador Dali's Swans Reflecting Elephants. What is that about, all right? This is a painting that's going to take you considerably more time that you have to engage with. And it will reward that time. I mean, you can see it in 3 seconds and walk away, just like Thomas Kincaid. Or you can keep looking for the levels. And that's, I think, what all 3 of you guys tried to do with your pieces, always.
Well, I think the thread that comes out of all of the things that we've talked about just recently is the fact that basically when you're painting figures and you're bringing them to a show, you're working for an audience. And what really makes the piece work, and it doesn't make any difference whether it's illustration or fine art, is communication with the audience. There has to be a communication between the painter and the person and the viewer. And it can occur at various different levels, as Jim pointed out. But there has to be some sort of communication there. If there's no communication, it's essentially self-indulgence by the artist, because he's created something that is so obscure and so obtuse that only he understands it. If it's going to work, there has to be a sense of communication. Now that doesn't mean it has to be very simple and easy to understand. Sometimes it does need to be challenging, and sometimes it can be simple on the surface and have challenging depths below it. But it is still very much of a communication effort, and I think when you're painting, that's something you want to keep in mind, is you are working for an audience, and start thinking in terms of how do I get my ideas across to somebody else.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shep, Joe, and Fletcher.
Before we break up, since this seems to be the last survivors of this year's MMSI show, after the show is closed, we're going back to my house, and Dennis Levy is making some cheesesteaks, Philadelphia cheesesteaks, direct from Philadelphia. So if you happen to be around or on your way to the airport or whatever and want to drop by, and anybody who is here is welcome to join us. We've got plenty of stuff, so there shouldn't be any problem with that. If you want to get directions on how to get there, just come up and see me. But anybody who's here is welcome to come and join us.
And if you think that Dennis is a good modeler, you should taste him on a cheesesteak.
Because it makes up for all of his other shortcomings.